In this video, we're going to cover how to work with objects and geometry modeling basics. First, let's cover how to create polygon primitives. Polygons is what you're going to be using 99% of the time to model your game environments. In order to create polygon primitives, there are two ways of doing so. First is to come up to Create Polygon Primitives and then choose which polygon primitive you want to create. Let's go back up to Create Polygon Primitives and say we want a cone. You will also notice that each option, each primitive, contains a box right next to it. This is an option box for that primitive. There are many tools that will contain an option box. So when we go and click on the cube and use the option menu instead, this will bring up an option menu panel. And here you can set width, height, depth, subdivisions, and a few other options. So instead of creating right away and then resizing it through the channel box, you can enter predetermined values and then create the cube. I'm going to delete this cube. Another way of creating polygons is to use the shelf. So you can click over to Polygons, make sure that's enabled, and then left click to create a cube, cylinder, or any other primitive polygons that are on the shelf right now. So this is a quick access menu. Instead of going to create drop-down menu and then creating it from here, this will actually create it a lot faster. You'll also notice that when we used an option menu, the cube was resized to the values that we used before. So let's go ahead and delete this cube and let's go back up to Create Polygons, Cube Option Menu, and let's use Edit and Reset Settings, and let's close it. So you can either use Create drop-down menu or Polygons shelf. Most of the time I use the Polygon shelf, and it's on rare instances I would go up to Create and Polygons. There are another set of primitives that you should know about. Go to Create, NURBS, and you will have another set of primitives that you can use. NURBS are complex curves and surfaces. And the reason you should know about NURBS is when you get more advanced, you will use NURBS primitives to start a certain specific modeling technique in order to create an object. And then you would convert that NURB to a polygon. So NURBS would be only used when you are more advanced in order to start a specific object, which later would be converted to a polygon object. So you would never actually use a NURB object and then export that. All your game environment models will be polygons, and that's what should be used to export and then import into a game engine. Now, you're not going to be using NURBS very often, but you may once in a while. Now that we have a couple of objects inside the viewport, if you left click on any object, this will select it. In order to access selection, you can come up to the toolbox and left click on the select tool, or use Q for hotkey. This will only allow you to select objects inside the scene. So left click to select any object and then press delete on the keyboard to remove that object. If you want to undo any function, just hit Z on the keyboard. If you want to marquee select multiple objects inside the scene, left click, hold and drag for marquee selection, and this will select multiple objects with your marquee selection. To deselect, just click off of any object inside the scene. To add or remove from a selection, left click to select one object, hold down Shift, and then left click on another object to add to a selection. If you want to remove an object from a selection, press Ctrl and then left click to remove that object. Throughout the videos, I will continue to remind you what the hotkeys are and how to delete, select, or remove selection from objects. So let's go ahead and marquee select both objects and hit delete to remove them. Now let's go ahead and create our cube again using the shelf, and you'll commonly use the channel box to input values for the dimensions of an object. Very often you'll know exact dimensions for a wall, a column, floor that you will use to create a piece of geometry for your game environment. So once you've created a polygon primitive, selected, let's come over to the channel box and let's go ahead and resize the width, height, and depth. These three values are going to be very important for game environment modeling. And also these three values will depend on the game engine and the scale dimensions that you're using in order to create your geometry. So as an example, in Unreal Engine 4, it's very common to have a floor piece to be 300 by 300 in width and depth and height of about 20. So let's go ahead and input those values now. Come over to the channel box, inputs for Polycube. Let's go ahead and set it to 300 in width, and in depth, we're going to set it to 300 as well. And for height, let's set it to 20. Now let's go ahead, come over and select the cube if it's not selected yet, and press F to center the viewport on the selected object. Now these values will greatly differ depending on the game and the game engine you're using. So I just gave you an example of the most common game engine and the values that you would use for a specific geometry. So you will do this a lot when you first create game environment assets, when you set a specific dimension for that object, and you will use the channel box to input those values. Let's go ahead and delete this floor piece. Select it and hit delete. And I'm going to get closer to our grid. There is one menu option that may or may not be turned on for you. In the previous versions of Maya, this was enabled by default. In the current version of Maya LT, this is disabled. It is something that some people use. I don't use it myself, but it's a very useful function to create geometry. If you go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and turn on Interactive Creation. And now if you try to create a cube or any other primitive polygon, you will have to create it manually. So with it enabled, left click and drag. This will give you the width and the depth of the object. Let go of the left mouse button, and now left click, hold, and move the mouse again to give height. And when you let go the second time, the cube will be created. This isn't the best way to create geometry, especially if that geometry is modular, because a lot of times you will need specific values for width, height, and depth. But it is an option to create your geometry using interactive creation method. So if we go ahead and create a cylinder, this was left clicking on the polygon shelf for the cylinder enables that function. Left click, hold, and drag to set the radius, let go, and now left click, hold, and drag to set the height. Let's go ahead, come up to create and turn that off. I'm going to hit Q for selection, select the object, hit delete, and select the cube and delete. Let's create the cube again. And now we're going to cover how to manipulate objects. We already covered Q or select tool, but the other three tools that you'll be using a lot is move, scale, and rotate. If you come over here on the left hand side to the toolbox, you have select tool, then you have the move tool or W, rotate or E, and scale R. So using the Q, W, E, R hotkeys, you can cycle between selection, move, rotate, and scale. I very rarely come over to the toolbox. I use the hotkeys to manipulate the objects. So let's go ahead and press W for move, and if you left click and hold and move your mouse over any of the three axes, this will move the object. If you come over right here in the middle, left click and hold, this will move the object without any constraint to the axes. Although it is very rare that you will need to move any object using the free transform along all three axes. Majority of the time, you'll move on a single axis only. If you press E, this will switch over to rotate. And you can do the same thing. Position your mouse over X, Y, or Z axes, left click, hold, and drag to rotate along that specific axis. And if you press R, this will switch over to scale tool. And left click and hold over X, Y, or Z to scale non-uniformly across one single axis. Or you can come over here right in the middle, left click and hold and move the mouse to scale uniformly across X, Y, and Z. Let's press W to switch over to the move tool. And one of the very important considerations that you should make when you begin modeling is to position your perspective viewport so it's relative to the orthographic viewports. And what this means is, let's zoom in on the object, you want to position the Z axis, the blue arrow, facing towards you. and the x-axis, or the red one, is facing to the right. And the reason we're doing this is if we switch over to the orthographic viewport, modeling will become a lot easier because the orthographic viewports will line up with the perspective viewport. So you can see that the blue, or the z-axis, is pointing towards us, so the top view is pointing towards you as well. And if we were modeling the object, let's say from around here, every time you switch over to the top, front, or side, it wouldn't be relative to the perspective viewport. Now this is a very useful function for when you begin to model inside Maya, because you want all 4 viewports to line up. So when you switch to the orthographic viewport, you know exactly what you're manipulating and where you are. But this will not cause any issues in your model. This is just a suggestion to make your modeling workflow in Maya a lot easier to begin with. But there's been a lot of times when I didn't line up the viewports and nothing bad will happen. It is one of those things that makes your job modeling a lot easier, especially as a beginner. Next, and probably one of the most commonly used functions to model game environments or any other object, is the component mode. Component mode is the ability to manipulate objects using vertices, edges, and faces. If you select any object inside the scene, right-click, hold, and you will have a menu pop up, and you can choose to switch that object to a component mode. You can switch over to a vertex, edge, face. You have a few other options such as vertex, face, multiple components, and UVs. Those are a little bit more advanced. The most commonly used ones are going to be vertex, edge, face, and object mode, which switches back to what you see right now. So right click, hold, switch into vertex, you're able to select vertices. Right click and hold, switch over to edge, you can select edges, and right click and hold, switch over to face, you can select faces. By left clicking, you can select individual component and then use the XYZ gizmo to move that component. If you press shift and left click, this will add to a selection, so you can choose to move multiple components, multiple of these faces, and if you have multiple components selected, using control you can remove from a selection. And we can do the same thing for vertices and edges. You can left click, hold and drag for marquee selection, or you can select one vertice, hold down shift, and add to a selection. Then once you have multiple vertices selected, use the XYZ gizmo and resize and manipulate that component to model your object. Let's just switch over to edge, select one edge, move it over, move it up. So the component mode for vertices, edges, and faces are going to be your go-to when you model game environments. And when you want to switch back to the object mode, just simply right click and go to object mode. The other options such as UV, multiple components, and vertex face, we won't be using them very often. Once you begin to UV and texture your object, you will use UVs, but to model, these 4 options, vertex, edge, face, and object mode, are your go-to. As you work with objects using the component mode, there are 5 shortcut keys that you should know about: F8, F9, F10, F11, and F12. Select the object, and if you press F9, this will switch over to vertices. F10 will switch over to edges. F11 will switch over to faces. And F12 will switch over to UV. And to jump back to object selection, press F8. So these 5 shortcut keys are very helpful. So instead of going right clicking and choosing a component mode, you would use these shortcut keys to speed up your workflow. And the last part of this video, I'm going to show you how to rename objects. This is going to become very important when you have multiple objects inside the scene and you want to organize your scene. Also, some game engines will pull the name of the object that you have inside Maya and use that name to import into a game engine. But overall, naming objects inside Maya is good practice. To name any object, simply select it, come over to the channel box, and left click on the default name or whatever other Polygon primitive you used, and then type in the name of the object that you want and press enter. If we create another, let's say we wanted to create a cylinder, let's move that out of the way. Left click to select it, left click on the name and rename it, and press enter. And that is how you rename objects. Now I know we've covered a lot of information in this video, and it may be hard to wrap your head around all the different functions that we just used, but there is a method to what I'm showing you. In a couple of more videos, we'll do an exercise which will take everything we learned so far and put it into practice. So in the next video, we're going to cover viewport viewing options.